Well, time is running out for those countries on the front lines of the climate crisis, like Madagascar, where low rainfall has led to severe drought. DW's correspondent Adrian Kriesch visited Tsiombe in the south, where the situation is particularly bad. Nearly 1.5 million people are dependent on aid, and many are living in famine-like conditions.
This is Manambovo River, or what's left of it. For 2 years, residents of Tsiombe have to dig in the riverbed, their main source of water.
We are truly suffering. Now it's really dry, dry, dry. No rainfall at all.
The rainy season should have already started, but once again, people are still waiting. Liferai and her family left their village and came to town because of the drought. Back home, everything had run dry, but here things were not much better.
Yes, it's a tiny house, but this is what we can afford to rent. Our house is in the village, far from here. But we come here because we need access to water. We brought all the kids here, and now they work as water carriers.
Fetching water and selling it is their only option of earning money for food. Every morning, this is the reality for tens of thousands in the region who live in villages without access to water. They have to transport their water containers to water sources, then fill them up and bring them back to their villages, of course, at a price. And it's often children who are doing this work, skipping school. Southern Madagascar has always been poorer and drier than the rest of the island. The recent drought, combined with decades of neglect by the central government, has aggravated the situation. We meet the regional governor. He says there are plans to build a road and a massive water pipe to bring in water from areas better off. But he can't say when.
You can expect those problems to be resolved within 1 year or 2 years. For the last 8 decades, nothing has been done. And this is the first government, this is the first regime which is taking care of the whole problem.
He says residents are also to blame because for generations they have been cutting down the forests in the area. Back at Manambovo River, Liferai says she has no energy to think about who or what is responsible for the crisis.
Sometimes the children don't get any money until the end of the day, so we eat late at night. Sometimes we don't eat the whole day, we just stay hungry. Then I just search for cactus fruits. Now we don't have anything to cook, so I need to go and look for cactus fruit so we have a meal.
So once again she ventures out in the heat, without shoes, looking for something to eat. Trying to make ends meet, finding food and water is all Liferai can think of every day.
And disasters like that are what's being discussed at the COP27 summit in Sharm el-Sheikh. I'm very pleased to welcome Lisa Yorka from the nonprofit Action Against Hunger Germany. Thank you so much for taking the time. In that last report, we just saw how communities in Madagascar have been ravaged by drought. What hope does COP27 offer people in that kind of situation?
There's two big topics around people impacted by droughts and other climate extremes here. One is around adaptation, so making sure people have the financing ready to adapt to the new living situation in a changed climate. Another one is dealing with loss and damages, because there's climate extremes that people cannot adapt to, making sure that when they lose their livelihoods, when they lose their properties, they can bounce back.
And on the issue of loss and damage, financing has been the issue that has dominated this COP. We know the EU and 4 national governments have pledged €1 billion to help African nations adapt. Do you think that that's enough?
It's, of course, a welcome sign, but it's definitely not enough. This $1 billion is likely part of a pledge that was already made of $100 billion in climate finance that rich governments said in 2009 they would pay out to developing countries by 2020 until 2025. And in Glasgow last year, they agreed to try and double the adaptation finance, so making sure people can adapt. But the needs are really much higher. We estimate that every year between $160 and $300 billion are needed for adaptation alone, and even more for loss and damage, between 290 and 580 billion euros per year just for developing countries.
So we're talking a little bit about how countries can adapt to the realities of a changing, warming world. But what about policies that get to the heart, to the root of the issue, to address climate change directly?
So this is being dealt with here as well. Last year, for example, last week, an initiative was launched by drought-stricken countries to work together, improve technology and making sure they can improve the use of water sources they have. But around weather patterns, it's really important to look for context-specific solutions. So this is what countries are trying to do here.
And we also know that women are disproportionately affected by the consequences of climate change. Is this summit addressing that this year?
So there's a gender action plan that's part of the COP every year, but I'm hearing from colleagues that it's not gone very far. But you're absolutely right, especially where droughts or food insecurity hits women and girls much harder than men and boys.
And from what you've seen so far at this summit, are you pleased by the results? Is it what you hoped to see coming out of this COP27, or do you think that the delegates needed to go much further?
Well, the proof is in the pudding, really, and it looks very likely that this summit will not end tomorrow as originally planned, but maybe go on until Saturday or Sunday. Currently, the negotiators are at a stage where they don't even have a draft, but a so-called non-paper, which is another way of saying that there's still lots of disagreement on the final declaration. The loss and damage issue really seems to be the sticking point. The mood here is quite tense, and I'm not sure how much this COP will help bring us a step closer to climate justice for those most affected.
Well, thank you very much for your time. That's Lisa Yorka from Action Against Hunger in Egypt. Iraq is one of those countries that could benefit from a loss and damage fund. The country is reeling from the effects of climate change. Sandstorms are frequent and lakes have dried up, as has much of its agricultural land.
This summer, Iraq's gazelles were the first victims of the drought that has swept the country for 3 years. They had no more grass, no foliage for shade. Dozens perished. Close by, one of Iraq's many dry lakes. The Sour Lake was a national landmark. Hydrologist Sarhan Al-Hafaji often brought his students here to the water.
The drying up of the Sawa Lake is primarily a consequence of climate change in Iraq, the lack of rain, and increased evaporation. What's more than 2,000 wells have recently been drilled in the area.
Those wells are meant for agriculture, but that didn't help. Iraq lost half of its agricultural land to the desert this year. On some days, temperatures reached an unbearable 55 degrees. Thousands of farmers have left their villages in southern Iraq.
You see it. The country is desolate. The earth is full of salt. We've become poor. We want to go away, but no one will take us in anywhere else.
The legendary palm trees of southern Iraq are just a memory. On the border between Iraq and Iran, Hassan Halil from the University of Basra explains how Iran has diverted multiple rivers into its own territory and dammed them up. Also responds to climate change. That means that almost no fresh water flows into Iraq anymore.
If you took a picture here 40 years ago, it would have been dark green. All kinds of palm trees grew here, with expensive, unique dates and gardens full of citrus fruits.
Baghdad in early summer. The water in the Tigris receded so much that people were able to stand in the river. The city choked on sandstorms. Climate experts say there will be more and more each year. While downstream on the Persian Gulf, there's less and less fresh water from Iraq's rivers, while more salt water is drifting in.
I expect sea levels to continue to rise due to climate change, and the land here is not high enough.
In less than 30 years, parts of southern Iraq could be inundated by the sea.